Hello, everybody. I would like to cordially welcome you to this edition of the European Astrobiology Institute biweekly seminar. My name is Wolf Geppert. I'm the chair of the European Astrobiology Institute, and I'm glad to welcome here Emmanuel Chavot. Emmanuel is professor at the University of Liège, member of the Belgian Academy of Sciences, and last but not least, leader of the working group on evolution of and traces of early life and life under extreme conditions of the European Astrobiology Institute. Again, let me cordially welcome you to this seminar, and I give over the floor to Emmanuel Chavot for today's talk. Many thanks for coming.
Thank you, Wolf. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to be here. So I will start my talk. Do you see the slides? Everything's okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. So my talk today will focus on early traces of the three domains of life, the challenges and the evidence that we have of this evolution. Of course, it's a huge topic, and I apologize in advance because I will not be able to cite all the great work that everybody does on these topics. But that's another challenge, actually, summarize these topics. So let's start. Today's life is very diverse. It's dominated by microbial life, life that we cannot see with our own eyes. It's dominated by prokaryotes, including the bacteria domain that you see here, the archaea domain, and there is a third domain called the eukaryotes or eukarya domain where we belong. As you can see right away, there's lots of clades represented by all these lines in the bacteria domain, which is a hugely diverse domain. The archaea also have many clades, all these little lines, and then the eukaryotes, the domain where we are, with plants, fungi, other animals, and mostly protists, unicellular microorganisms. It's not so diverse actually compared to the prokaryotes. But of course, these are modern life. So this is an idea of the diversity of modern life on Earth, and it doesn't represent all life that existed on Earth, of course. It's only the tip of the iceberg. Just a little reminder, if you forgot your school years, prokaryotes mean a cell without organelles or a nucleus, and eukaryotes have nucleated cells and other organelles. So, because this is only the tip of the iceberg, Darwin also already said that the tree of life should perhaps be called the coral of life, because modern life rests on many dead branches, as you can see here on this figure that Gogarten drew. You can see modern life here on the top of the figure, that's present-day life. And all the black lines are the lines that we try to reconstruct using different kinds of tools that I will talk about. But actually, it represents only a little part of all life that existed, represented by all these branches. So again, this figure, when we look at it, we try to reconstruct the history of life from the origins of life to the first cells that diversified, lots of different clades, possibly, even perhaps different origins of life, actually. And then some of these clades led to the Eukarya, the same ancestor, the common ancestor of modern life as we know it today. But we only see these few lines that we try to go back to Eukarya and then the first cells in the origin of life. I hear some noise in the background. Can you stop it? Thank you. So to reconstruct this history of life, going from the origins to now, we can follow different paths. We can take a bottom-up approach, starting with the formation of planetary systems, rocky planets, habitable planets, and then this involves astrophysicists. And then we can start to imagine and test in laboratory experiments what kind of conditions are necessary for life, looking at what geologists tell us about the early conditions of Earth. We can try to imagine different prebiotic pathways going from simple molecules to the first cells. And we can also imagine what kind of first metabolism would appear at the beginning of life on Earth. We can also take the top-down approach, looking at modern life with biology. We can look at the history of Earth from today, comparing different features that we will measure or observe in rocks today, and go back down through time to try to reconstruct the history of the planet. We can also, of course, look at fossils, different kinds of traces that can be chemical or morphological, that will tell us something about not only the ancestor of this modern life, but also other forms of life that are completely extinct, but we can document them in the rock record. And we can do all kinds of analysis on rocks, geochemical analysis, and on fossils to try to better understand the coevolution of life and the environments. Our friends, the philosophers and the historians, are very important also in this challenge of reconstructing the history of life, because they remind us of all the preconceived ideas that we have, the misconceptions that we start to discuss about, and all things that we have really to be careful about. So the approach I use in this talk is the top-down approach. So to reconstruct the history of life and Earth, we need samples, and samples are rocks. The rocks are great because they both preserve the history of Earth and the history of life. Geologists have described the time through the geological timescale that you can see here, very simplified in the bottom, starting with the formation of the Earth of more than 4.56 billion years ago. That's the first eon called the Hadean. Between 4 billion and 2.5 billion years ago, you have the Archean, when the first traces of life are found. Between 2.5 billion years and 0.5 billion years ago, you have the Proterozoic, when life diversified. And finally, in the last 540 million years, you have the Phanerozoic, when you see all the life that is visible with the naked eyes, but not only. So the rock record that allows us to reconstruct this long history goes back to about 4 billion years ago. Unfortunately, before 4 billion years ago, we don't have any rocks remained. So we are missing this part in the geological record, but we still have a few information from minerals that are very old, zircons, and they can tell us something about the condition of the early Earth. So we go to places, to samples, we go to places that preserve very well old rocks, like Australia, South Africa, China, and many others. And we can use different kinds of tools to find these traces of life and reconstruct their environment. So basically, we go from the field to the lab, from the macro scale things to micro, nano, and even nanoscales to study these possible traces. From the macro scale, we need first a hammer and cars, or we also need drilling systems to recover drill cores of rocks that are better preserved under the surface. This is, for example, a project supported by the ICDP, the International Continental Drilling Program, that allow international consortia of scientists to recover these precious rocks and to study them. This is also the approach that ExoMars will take when it will drill 2 meters, only 2 meters, but it's not bad, 2 meters down through Mars crust to find well-preserved rocks that might preserve early traces of life. We don't know yet. So from this, we get the samples. We can study how they are distributed in the rocks. We can study them at the macro scale to understand what kind of environment was there. We can look at what we call sedimentary structures to know if we were in a in a fluviatile environment, a marine environment, a lacustrine environment, a desert, or whatever. From these samples, we go to the lab and we cut them in thin slices, like you see here, in thin sections. Actually, I can show you one, but I don't know if you will see well. This is a thin section from this rock. So we take some small samples, we cut them in slices, and with this thin section, we can study what kind of minerals form the rocks, and this can tell us a little bit of the conditions of formation of the rocks. We can see sometimes structures like you see here. They can tell us if there was some water running through, for example, in this environment. We can also destroy the rock with acids, dissolve the minerals, and extract the organic material. You can see here the little dust that you can see or that you don't see. This is full of fossil organic material, and among these you might find microfossils. So from this little dust, we can mount them into this kind of slice, macroscopic slice, and that's what you see here on my screen. And sometimes, surprise, you find treasures. You find beautiful microfossils, and there can be tons of them, not just one or two. So if you look at the zoom from this microscopic slice, you can see sometimes these beautiful fossil cells that you see here. And from these fossils, we can, of course, do all kinds of analysis, cut them in ultrathin section to look to them with electron microscopes and see what kind of structure are preserved in the wall. We can analyze the composition of the wall using Raman or infrared spectroscopy. We can measure isotopes. We can extract from these rocks fossil molecules. We can also use other methods to date the rock. We can do a chemical analysis of the rock to know if there was a little bit of oxygen in the water column or not. And all these analyses require a set of instruments that goes higher and higher in resolution, starting with a simple microscope to electron microscope, spectrometer, and synchrotron to have a really high resolution. We can also do comparative analysis on modern organisms, bacteria or protists, again using the same tools. And we can compare them, these data with fossils, try to find out what kind of life these fossils represent. So these combined studies of the rocks and life traces allow to reconstruct first the history of the Earth, which is very important to try to understand life evolution. And these studies of these really old rocks back to 4 billion years and even before 4 billion years using zircons tell us that Earth is habitable since at least, well, about 4.3 billion years ago. And quite quickly, we have evidence of an active geological cycles with a diversity of environment, shallow water to deep water environment, even some continental environment. You see here a fossil beach that's 3.2 billion years ago. You can see also this pillow lava, that means lava cooled down in water, another indirect evidence of liquid water at the surface of the Earth. And of course, the chemical composition of the atmosphere and ocean also changed through time. You see here a box representing the ocean conditions, here the atmosphere condition. We start with Earth in the Hadean and beginning of the Archean with no oxygen in the atmosphere and no oxygen in water, in ocean. Then perhaps a little bit of oxygen production, but this is discussed. Then a higher production called the great oxidation event, but it's not so much oxygen yet. Still, it's much more than before, between around 1% perhaps of oxygen in the atmosphere. And then we go through a long period of history of the Earth where the ocean was stratified with the deep water anoxic and rich in sulfur or iron, rare examples of oxygen even in deep water, and mostly the oxygenated water were at the surface where cyanobacteria were doing photosynthesis and producing oxygen. It's only at the end of the Proterozoic that we have a fully oxygenated water column, and then we go through the modern condition that we know today. Other geological events that might have influenced the evolution of the Earth, of our life, sorry, are the formation and fragmentation of supercontinents that happened several times during Earth's history. Big impact events, you know that meteorites fall all the time on Earth, but luckily for us, they are very small. But sometimes we have bigger impact that can have some influence on life, evolution. And then finally, we also have episodes of large glaciation through the history of the Earth, especially in the Neoproterozoic and in the Paleoproterozoic here. So studying the rocks, these precious samples allow to reconstruct the history of Earth, but of course we have many gaps, and we try to reconstruct the global history, but locally the conditions can be very different. And these local tiny conditions, that's what's important probably for the origin of life and the diversification and evolution of the different clades that make up today's ecosystems. So what kind of life can we look for in these very old rocks? Of course, we won't find big dinosaurs with big skeletons. We won't find DNA or RNA. I'm talking about several billion-year-old rock. But we still have traces that we can track through the rock record. They can be biosedimentary structures such as stromatolites. You can see here huge stromatolites that are about 2.5 billion years old. These are made of carbonates, but we can also find biosedimentary structure in fine-grained siliciclastic rocks or in sandstones. We'll talk about it later. We can, of course, look for microfossils. These fossils, they can be preserved in different ways. The organic walls can be compressed in mud, parallel to bedding, in rocks like these, shales, that are finely laminated. And simply the organism will sediment with the mud and then be compacted, flattened parallel to this bedding. And then we can retrieve them from the rocks and study them. They can also be covered with minerals or replaced by minerals, like you see here in this example of protists, a tested amoebae, where the organic wall is being replaced by phosphate. Here you have a colony of bacteria covered by silica, where the organic material has disappeared, but the silica makes a cast of the colony. And there are many other different cases of preservation of life, traces and cells and filaments, colonies, microbial mats that can be preserved in with these processes. We can also have chemical traces of life, such as isotopic fractionation of different elements that life uses in its metabolism, like carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, iron. And we can look for fossil molecules or molecular fossils that some geochemists call biomarkers. Biomarkers can be many things depending on your discipline. So I will call them molecular fossils. These include lipids or pigments, and these are mostly the lipids of cell membranes that we can find in rocks as old as 1.7 billion years, more or less. So with all these tools, then we can try to go back more and more in the rock record and find traces of life and reconstruct the evolution of the 3 domains and perhaps even go beyond LUCA. Of course, this is difficult, and there are many challenges to do that. The first challenge is that not every rock gets preserved. We live on a very dynamic planet, which is great for the habitability of our planet. We have the plate tectonics that will recycle the crust of the Earth, recycle the atmosphere composition, allow to have a thick atmosphere to have liquid water on the surface. But that means also that we will erase, erode, transform the former rocks. You can see here examples of several kinds of geological processes like erosion, mountain building, orogenesis, erosion by river, by wind. All this will erase rocks. So that means we miss part of the history, a big part of the history of the Earth. Another challenge is that different types of life have different compositions, and they will not all get preserved. So again, we have only a few percentage of examples of life that existed since the origin of life. You see here different examples again, like big animals with skeletons or tiny protists, unicellular eukaryotes with a skeleton of silica here, a diatom. But you have also all kinds of organisms that don't make any mineral parts, like worms or flowers or bacteria or archaea or amoebae, all kinds of organisms that have perhaps not much chance to get preserved, but it happens that we can preserve soft-bodied organisms in specific conditions. So in general, fossilization is a complex process of all kinds of physical, chemical, and biological reactions, and it's rare compared to all the diversity that ever existed on Earth. Another challenge is the preservation of this life, depending on the different physico-chemical conditions of the environment where they live and where they die. They will get preserved and fossilized or not. You see here example of well-known Shark Bay in Australia. So this is a carbonate platform with hypersaline water, where you have stromatolites growing still now. Here you have the Yellowstone in the USA, where you have hot springs with water rich in silica. You have all kinds of life there, but the microbial mats that live there, they will be perhaps preserved by silicification, whereas here in Australia, they will be preserved by carbonate minerals. Here you are in the North Sea, where you have fine-grained or coarser-grained sandstones, sand grains, deposited along the sea. And there you also have microbial mats growing, but they will be preserved in another way. And in Antarctica, you are in a lake where all these mats are growing, cyanobacterial mats. They are happy there because they have no animals eating them. And they can grow on the surface or bottom of the lake or under ice at the bottom of the lakes. And in these conditions, they will be preserved by clay minerals or tiny carbonate minerals that will cover all the cells and preserve lipids, pigments, as you can see here, this drill core, and minerals. So the preservation conditions, the taphonomy of the traces and the diagenesis will be very important. If the rock is preserved, the trace is preserved through diagenesis, there's still another challenge because, again, we are on a dynamic planet. Sometimes we have big tensions. Plate tectonics will be colliding, and this will exert a huge pressure and temperature on the rocks and on the traces of life that are preserved in these rocks. You can also have hot fluids going through the rocks and heating up the rocks and the organics that they contain. So this is explained in this nice review, where you have first cells with lots of complex molecules that characterize this biological organic matter and different elements. And through diagenesis, once the cell is buried in sediments, these cells start to degrade. You start to lose elements. You have organic material that be more and more organized, especially the carbon-bearing molecules. And if you continue the transformation through higher temperature and pressure, you go through the metamorphism window and you lose all these light elements. And so you have a relative enrichment in carbon that will become more and more organized to finally perhaps form crystalline carbon. So that means that with this transformation of through diagenesis and then metamorphism, we lose the biological information. Here you see examples of 3 fossil cells. One here that's 1 billion year old, 1.6 billion year old, and 3.2 billion year old. And you can see that the color changed just because there is an increase in metamorphism and loss of volatiles and increase in carbon content. If you continue to heat up these fossils, then you have pure carbon, you have graphite. So all these parameters are important to take into account when we try to interpret if we really have a trace of life in our sample, and then what kind of life it is. One of the perhaps biggest challenge are the abiotic processes that can mimic life, morphologies, and chemistries, and form pseudo-signature that we can misinterpret as real traces of life. Many people work on this, and there's more and more work to understand these challenges. You can understand this through lab experiments or through the study of natural samples. In this lab experiment, you see examples of artificial structures that resemble stromatolites, or minerals that auto-assemble to form segmented filaments that look like what some bacteria do. Or you can also have colonies of silica balls that look like colonies of cells. You can have silica tubes that are hollow, or here you have other examples of lab experiments mixing organic material with sulfur and formation of spiraling filaments, again, morphologies that we know in biology. In natural samples, we can also do or measure different parameters, such as the isotopic fractionation of carbon, an element that's, of course, ubiquitous in life. And we can see that the fractionation of carbon, meaning the ratio between different isotopes of carbon, 12 and 13, can have different kinds of values. Here you have the range of values for different metabolism. Doesn't matter what they are here, but you see the range of fractionation of the biological processes is similar to the range of fractionation of abiotic processes that happen here in high temperature in hydrothermal conditions. And this is kind of a problem, because more we go back to the history of the Earth, more Earth was hot, and especially in the Archean, there was a lot of hydrothermal activity where we could both form organic molecules, organic material, with isotopic carbon fractionation that has the same value as life. So again, the geological context is very important to understand if we really have something that was made by life or not preserved in the rocks. So this happens in hydrothermal conditions, but it also happens in low temperature conditions. In this paper, Marie-Catherine Sforna showed that by alteration of the oceanic crust at low temperature, there was formation also of carbonaceous material particles. This abiotic carbonaceous material, CM, can migrate in rocks, a little bit like petroleum can migrate in rocks, and can envelop minerals. And then these minerals look like, well, these shapes look like morphologies of life, but actually abiotic morphologies. The organic material itself can be biological or abiotic in origin, but the morphologies are abiotic. This is well shown in this example. In a chert, so in a silica-rich rock, you have organic material migrating in the rocks along minerals, like here, or forming little bubbles. And if you're not careful, you could think that these are fossil cells, but actually they are not. And we can understand that because we look at the context, the geological context. So another important point is that the presence of organics doesn't mean presence of life, of course. We know that for a long time, since the synthesis of urea by Wöhler, but still, sometimes there is a misunderstanding between organics and biological. So let's see very few examples, because there's so many examples in the literature. Perhaps the oldest traces that has been proposed as possible traces of life are these little particles of graphite preserved in one of these tiny minerals I was talking about earlier, zircons. So in this zircon is 4.1 billion years old. And in this zircon, there are carbon particles, and they have isotopic fractionation of carbon that's compatible with life processes. So this paper proposed that this is an evidence for life 4.1 billion years ago. On other paper, you can look at, this is a debate, of course, because there are several crucial issues here. We don't have any geological context for this carbon. You find this zircon preserved in younger rocks, so you don't know where the carbon comes from. The presence of carbonaceous material can be biological or abiotic, and this kind of isotopic fractionation can also be abiotic or biological in origin. So even if it's possible that life appeared for even 4.3 billion years ago, we don't know. We still need strong evidence to show that it is indeed the case. And here, it's still possible that this was made by an abiotic processes. So we cannot claim that this is a trace of life, for sure. Another big debate is going on also about this structure described first as stromatolites that are 3.7 billion years old. They are preserved in Greenland. So we have these tiny cones that are centimeter at the centimeter scales, and the author that described these interpret them as stromatolites. But then other people went back to the same outcrops, studied the rocks, and interpreted this structure not as stromatolite, but as deformation structures formed in metasediment, meaning sediments that have been highly metamorphosed with high temperature and pressure and fluids going through. So because there is an abiotic possibility for this structure, it's unlikely that these are stromatolites. These actually are cones going towards the top of the rock, but you can find also structure going down on the other side. So that was suspicious for these authors, but there are also other geochemical arguments and also the possibility of this deformation. The debate is not finished. There are more papers published on this, but I'll let you read them. Another example of possible traces of life that was described was these tubes in basaltic glass. So in the oceanic crust, you can have, or in pillow lavas, you can have all these little tubes. They can have different kinds of shapes. And they were described as 3.4, almost 3.5 billion years old bacterial traces of life, alterating the rocks. But then a series of papers showed that you can actually explain this kind of structure just by alteration, abiotic alteration of this kind of basaltic glass. You can see all the paper here. So again, there is an explanation, an abiotic explanation that's possible. So we cannot claim that this is an unambiguous trace of life. Perhaps the oldest traces of life on which everybody agrees are these stromatolites. These stromatolites are preserved in the Strely Pool Formation of Australia. This is about 3.42 billion years old. They are not very big either. They are about 10 centimeters high, but there are a lot of them. You can see the lamination in the cones and between the cones. Some of them have secondary stromatolites growing on them on steep side of the cones, so they have some evidence of branching. They are preserved in a habitable geological context in shallow water. These rocks have been also have seen hot fluids going through them, so the geochemistry is a little bit altered, but still there is evidence that there was a marine carbonate environment. There are different morphologies depending on the hydrodynamic conditions. So there is some ecology, evidence of ecology. They are growing upward in the floating zone, so they are taken as an indirect evidence for anoxygenic photosynthesis, so using light but not producing oxygen. One of the clue to say that this might be life and not an abiotic precipitation of minerals is that in the cones you can find the distribution of carbonaceous material associated with isotopes of carbon and sulfur, indicating of life processes. And this organic material is not distributed randomly in these structures. So here it's really the combination of all this evidence plus the difficulty to explain abiotically this coincidence of evidence that point to a biological origin. And this is really the key when we go back to these really old rocks, is to find combination of evidence, not only one evidence, and to try to falsify the abiotic explanation. Another example that I know a little bit better because I work on it is the Moody's group in South Africa. So it's a bit younger, 3.2 billion years old. These rocks are preserved in the Barberton area. They cover quite an extensive area. They are really well studied in terms of sedimentology, geochronology. We know the age, we know the environments. You can see evidence of shallow water. Here you have a ripple sands formed in on a beach. We have also fluviatile environment. So this is a really nice preserved transition between continents and marine environments. It's one of the oldest one that is so well preserved actually. But it's a siliciclastic environment, not a carbonate environment. So many people are working on this, have been working for 20 or more years on these settings. And now we have a new ICDP project that will drill these rocks to try to find traces of life that are better preserved and rocks that are better preserved, so we better understand the Archean environment. So what kind of traces of life were found there? Well, there are extensive structures described as macrobial mats that are preserved in these rocks. Some of them are preserved in fluviatile environments, so these are the oldest traces of life on continental grounds. While macrobial mass, you have these wavy lines of organic material deposited or preserved in siliciclastic rocks. They trap minerals. They are associated with nitrogen, carbon, and sulfur isotope fractionation, indicating life processes. So there are different kinds of evidence pointing to a biological origin. In other rocks of the Moody's group, we see in thin section these structures that are a bit oval or circular. We can see them parallel to the bedding or flattened perpendicular, parallel to the bedding, sorry. So if we look at let's see my little bit of rocks here. These are shales and siltstone. You can see the thin laminations. And if you look in thin section, you will find these dark objects parallel to the lamination. That means they were embedded during sedimentation. So that's an evidence of not only endogenicity, they are in the rock, but syngenicity. They were included at the time of the formation of the rock. To prove the syngenicity, we can also perform Raman spectroscopy on all kinds of organic material preserved in these rocks, and this is compatible with the regional history of the Moody's group. We can also put these rocks in acids that destroy the minerals, but not the kerogen, and find these structures that are organics. Raman spectroscopy also shows that these are made of carbon. They have a cellular morphology. They are a little bit folded because they were flexible. You can see here different examples. This is what happened on younger fossil cells also. And when we cut them with an ultramicrotome to look at the structure of the wall, we can see that these are actually hollow vesicles. You see the interior of the fossil cells here that are preserved. These fossils, we think they are fossil because of all these characters. They are associated with carbon isotope fractionation that's compatible with life. They occur as a population. This is only not It's not only one fossil, but it's about 100 fossils. And because of, again, the combination of habitable geological environment, the taphonomy, the way they are preserved in clay-rich sediments, the morphology, the fact that they are hollow, they are carbonaceous, they are folded because they were flexible, they occur as a population, and the fact that we don't know how to explain this abiotically, all this combination of features point to biology. However, we don't know what kind of biology it is. So after all these challenges, we still have another challenge. When we have a structure, a morphology, or a molecule, and we know that it is life, then we need to find out what kind of life it is. For example, here you have different kinds of examples of microbial mats or microbially induced sedimentary structures or myths. They can be as old as almost 3.5 billion years old. In South Africa, these are the Moody's Group ones. You find the 1 billion year old ones in Scotland here, where you see this structure looking like elephant skin. You can see here a picture. And then when you zoom in, you see a thin section in the rock. You zoom in again, and then sometimes you can find fossil cells preserved. Or in this example, again, this is a thin section in the rock. You see organic material preserved as these wavy laminations. This is really an immature rock. If you destroy the minerals with acids, then you can extract sheets of polysaccharides made by these mats, and they are covered with all these little filaments. If you zoom, you see these are cells that have been replaced by pyrites. We don't know yet what kind of life it was, probably bacteria, but we're not sure which ones. They were producing these mats. So we have evidence of life, we have the isotopes, the morphology, sometimes the chemistry also, the molecules, but it's not always easy to know what kind of life it is. And one way to find out what kind of prokaryotic life we have, mostly prokaryotic life, is to look at these isotope fractionations of different elements that life uses and combine it with morphological or mineral or organic traces of life. You can see here in a nice review that Kevin Lepo published recently, the evidence of life based on isotope fractionation, and you can see all kinds of different metabolism that go back to the Archean. So this is an important way to trace life, because when you fossilize a prokaryote, it's as often a simple morphology. It's not easy just from the morphology to say what it is. You can do it sometimes with cyanobacteria because they're a bit more complex, but not most other prokaryotes. So combining with isotopic fractionation helps to find out what kind of life it is. But of course, there are many challenges again to this approach. I already talked about the possibility of abiotic fractionation, and that's why it's important to combine this isotope signature with morphological traces or mineral traces. There is also the knowledge gap in modern biology. So life is very diverse, as we said in the beginning, but there are still many clades that we don't know about, and we don't know what kind of metabolism they have, especially in all the new archaea that are found these days, but also all these purple clades of bacteria. We know that they exist because of their genomes, but we don't know what they look like and we don't know what they do. So all kinds of new, perhaps, signature to find out. And this is modern life. But what about the signature of their ancestors, or the ancestors of bacteria, or all these clades of bacteria, or the first bacteria before the last common ancestor of bacteria, and same for archaea. And then even before Luca, the last common ancestor of the three domains of life, there was life already, cellular life, but we don't know what kind of metabolism it had and what kind of traces we can find. Perhaps we found it, but we don't know how to recognize it. So there are still many questions about these traces. One A clue to the presence of archaea in the rock record is the evidence of methanogenesis, the production of methane. Until recently, we thought it was unique to archaea, and then a good evidence for archaea going back to 2.7, perhaps 3 billion years ago, and more debatedly 3.5 billion years ago. But recently, some people have found that cyanobacteria can also produce methane. Yet, even more recently, somebody showed that it was actually a transfer of genes from archaea to cyanobacteria, so probably more recent than in the Archean, but we don't know. All that to say that things are not simple to interpret. So once we have life, we don't always know what it is. For prokaryotes, we can look at isotopic fractionation and so have some clues. For other morphological fossils, like the examples that you see here that are preserved either as carbonaceous compressions or as mineralized scales or mineralized tests or skeletons. They can be preserved in clay-rich sediment or in silica in 3 dimensions. They can be microbial mats or simple cells or more complex cells. So we have a challenge here to try to find out what kind of life these objects are. And one of the things we want to be able to do is to try to recognize eukaryotes, nucleated cells, among these fossils. Of course, we don't have access to the nucleus. The DNA has been long gone. So we have access to other clues that might help us to identify them. We can look at the morphology of the fossils, the wall ultrastructure, the wall chemistry, and all that in their environmental context with all kinds of tools or methodologies going from simple microscope to electron microscope to spectrometer and to techniques coupled to synchrotron to access higher resolution information. So we have defined a set of characters that allowed us to identify eukaryotes among the prokaryotes, among the prokaryotes and other perhaps simple eukaryotes in fossil assemblages. We use a character combination that's not known in prokaryotes, some kind of complexity in the morphology, in wall ornamentation. You can see fossil cells bearing spines or with wall made of plates. They can divide in particular ways that prokaryotes don't do. They can produce cysts with a more complex opening, like a little hole here with a cover, or there are other ways to open cysts that prokaryotes don't do. They can show complex multicellularity. Multicellularity is known in prokaryotes. So when you have a filament or a colony, you have multicellularity, but there are different degrees of complexity in multicellularity. We can also look at the wall ultrastructure, see if it's like here made of little plates that are imbricated, or if there is canals or some kind of complexity. We can look at the chemical composition of these objects. Either they are organics and we use spectroscopic tools, or they might produce unique biopolymer that are known only in eukaryotes, or produce biominerals that are organized and complex, forming this kind of scales, for example, or they can include metals that can tell us something about metabolisms. The size is not a good criteria in itself because pico-eukaryotes are known, so 1 or 2 micron in diameter eukaryotes, and bacteria can be a few hundred micron long or in diameter for a few of them. So size by itself is not good enough criteria. It has to be combined with all the other kind of characters. So once we use this combination of characters, sometimes we can recognize this object as eukaryotes and not prokaryotes. So we can identify them at the level of the domain, but sometimes we can even identify them at the level of a specific clade. Regardless of taxonomy, if we cannot say what kind of eukaryotes it really is, we can still document the evolution of biological innovations, looking through the change in assemblages through time, from the Archean through the Proterozoic, mostly in the Proterozoic. But again, there are big challenges in this adventure to understand the evolution of eukaryotes. we still have the challenge of the incompleteness of the rock and fossil records. We have another challenge is the transformation from a living organism to a fossil. You have diagenetic transformation, then possibly metamorphism. So this will erase some information and transform it. There are many modern organisms that we still, either we don't know that they exist, or we know that they exist, but we don't know what they are made of. This used to be a common approach in the late 1900s to you look at the morphology, ultrastructure, and chemistry of the walls of these protists. But nowadays, it's less and less done. So there's still a lot of things we don't know about even the life cycle of modern protists. We can have different type of preservation depending on the environment where these fossil cells are preserved. For example, here you see the same species. Here it's preserved in 3 dimensions in a chert, in silica-rich rock, and there it's preserved as a carbonaceous compression in shale, in clay-rich rocks. So it can have quite a different aspect. Some protists have very different morphologies depending on their life stages. You see here a dinoflagellate with a vegetative cell on the left and a cyst on the right, and they are quite different. And actually, at first, they were described with different genus name and species name. And then when somebody cultivates them in the lab, then you know the life cycle and you understand the differences. But this is difficult to do with all protists. We can have also convergence of morphologies and chemistry in between organisms that are not related, and even between domains, like on this example with amoebozoa and bacteria that look the same. And there is also a huge hidden diversity of very tiny eukaryotes that are the size of bacteria. You can see on this picture, tiny protists and the bacteria next to this huge protists, Euglenozoa, that's a few tens of microns in size. And this hidden diversity of tiny eukaryotes, it's hidden already in modern days, but in fossil assemblages, it's even more difficult to track down. And finally, it's also difficult to find out exactly what kind of eukaryotes we have, and then where to place it in the tree of eukaryotes. Here you see modern eukaryotes, what we call Crohn group. Modern eukaryotes and their ancestor, they go back to a last common ancestor called LECA, the last eukaryotic common ancestor. This is not the first eukaryote. Before this LECA, there were different kinds of protists, unicellular eukaryotes, but perhaps multicellular also, and then FICA, a first eukaryotes. So our fossils, sometimes we can place them on one of these modern groups, but often we cannot, and we don't know if they are here or there in the tree. On this figure, you can see a nice summary of the diversity of modern eukaryotes that are placed into supergroups based on the genomes. You see the different names, and I put there the fossils that we can identify as fossil member of these modern supergroups. So you can see the ages and the fossils. There are some debate about some of them, but most of them date back to a few, almost 1 billion year old, 1 billion year ago, perhaps even 1.6 billion year ago, but that's more debated. And that provides us a minimum age for the common ancestor of modern eukaryotes. The oldest fossil that we can relate to a modern eukaryote are these red algae that are 1 billion year old, perhaps 1.6 billion year old. This is a fossil that's multicellular and photosynthetic. That means at that time, eukaryotes had already acquired a plast from a cyanobacterial ancestor. That means this is not the first modern eukaryote. This is quite far from LECA. LECA, the common ancestor of modern eukaryotes, is thus much older than 1.1 billion years ago. So we can have minimum ages provided by this evidence from fossils. Most of these studies look at the morphology only, but some of them, like this nice study by Corentin Leron, look at not only the morphology, but also the ultrastructure and the chemistry of the fossil to try to identify this fossil as fungi. And this is done also for some other ongoing studies of other fossils. This, if we want to go back beyond LICA, so this is again the diversity of modern eukaryotes. This is LICA, the last common ancestor or the most recent ancestor of these modern eukaryotes. LICA is quite a complex modern protist, according to biologists. It has a nucleus, it has organelles, it has a mitochondria, it has a flagellum, it can swallow other protists or bacteria, so it's quite a complex modern-like protist. So of course it's not the first eukaryotes. Before LICA, there was a diversity of protists, and before them, FICA, the first eukaryotic common ancestor. To go from FICA to LICA required many complex evolution, the acquisition of all the eukaryotic cellular features, such as the nucleus, an endomembrane system, a cytoskeleton, the mitochondria. This is called eukaryogenesis, going from FICA to LICA. And actually, the timing and the order or acquisition of these features is not known yet, or it's debated. There are many models for eukaryogenesis and for FICA, and there's a huge literature about that. Here are a few reviews, modern reviews about it, but recently a very important discovery was made by Anja Spang, actually, and her collaborator. They found some archaea that were really close, that seems to be really close to the ancestor of eukaryotes, or FICA. So the origin of eukaryotes involved an archaea from the Asgard clade, an ancestor of the mitochondria. We know that they are from alpha proteobacteria, perhaps other bacteria. This is suggested by several people in recent papers, by Lopez Garria and Moreira also. So FICA is either an archaea that's changing or a consortium of archaea and bacteria. This is all ongoing research, and there's a lot of new things going on all the time if you want to follow this literature. But coming back to my fossils, I was talking about that because we have a challenge with our fossils. Once we know they are eukaryotes, we sometimes don't know where to put them. Are they here or somewhere there? The oldest eukaryotic macrofossils that we have found so far in the rock record are about 1.65 billion years old, or a little bit older. They consist on populations of organic wall vesicles that are preserved in clay-rich sediments. They have a quite complex morphology. You can see, for example, this one preserved in China, as a wall decorated with little spines or processes. The wall itself is made of plates. You can see here a zoom on this fossil with an electron microscope. We can see all these little spines. We can see the ornamentation on the surface of the wall. And if you plunge in a crack in the wall of the fossil, you can see that the inner surface of the wall, and you see the wall is made of these really nice little organic plates that are about 2 microns in diameter. They are beveled, they are imbricated next to each other. You can see them here very well too, in this thin section in the wall of the fossil. So you see the fossil is flat, like a pancake, a hollow pancake. You see here the hollow inside of the cell and the wall made of plates. So this kind of complexity, will not enter in the details of all the eukaryotic macrofossils, but this kind of details suggests strongly that there we have a eukaryotes with a cytoskeleton, with evidence of life cycles also, with cyst opening, vegetative cells. We have all kinds of a high degree of complexity that's really found to an unambiguous eukaryotic affinity, and perhaps even a LICA affinity. So I'm almost done. I don't know what time it is. It's almost 1 hour. So I'm in the conclusion.
So
Sorry?
it's already later than 5, so.
Okay, I'm concluding. So the first conclusion is that using all these very precious samples that record both the history of Earth and life, we can try to understand life evolution on Earth, combining again morphological and chemical evidence. We have minimum ages for the 3 domains of life. Minimum ages, that means they are older than that. And we can also track the evolution of biological innovation and ecosystems through time. We can also use this knowledge and understanding of life beginning on Earth and Earth's early conditions to define what makes a planet habitable, to define what is a biosignature and how it gets preserved, how to characterize it. Then we can try to characterize how we can detect these traces of life, these biosignatures beyond Earth in the solar system, like the ongoing missions on Mars, or even beyond the solar system, for example, in exoplanet atmospheres. And anyway, even if we don't find traces of life, all this is good because we understand better the universe and the Earth and life on Earth, which is also important. If you want to know more about this project and possibilities actually for PhDs and postdoc, please go to this website because there are new projects and positions. Just one word for the traces of life on Mars, because several of us are involved in Mars mission and especially ExoMars that will leave in 2022. And this is really exciting because ExoMars will land at Oxyaplanum, which preserve a lot of rocks that are rich in clay minerals. Clay minerals, this is the kind of mineral that preserve the beautiful fossils that I just showed you and the nice microbial mats that we can find through the rock records starting in the Archean. Clay minerals are also important for other things. They can indicate aqueous processes. They can be catalysts of prebiotic chemistry. They can provide redox reagent for source of energy. And a great thing about the early history of Mars, the Noachian, is that it covers a time that we don't have on Earth, the Hadean. And that's perhaps the time when life appeared on Earth. So if we could have some information about that time period on early Mars, that would be really cool. So all this work is done in many places of the world, but also with people in my lab. And this is really a nice team of young people that you see there, but also many collaborators and people who give money. And thank you for your attention.
Oh, thanks also to our speaker. And now it's time for questions and discussion contributions. You can do this in 2 different ways because we don't really have a raise hand function here in this program. So either you switch on your camera so that I can see you and then I can give you the word. Also, you can ask a question via the chat forum, and the chat button is on the top to the right of the dashboard, so you can actually see that here. So click on that and then a question into the chat. So who wants to be the first who asks a question? Yeah. So here is a question by Pierre Saint-Joffre. Hi, Emmanuel, and thank you for this excellent talk. One question. What is the best evidence for you of the presence of cytoskeleton in the fossil record?
I think, can you still see my presentation or not?
No, we can't.
No?
No, you
Not
stopped
anymore.
sharing the screen.
Perhaps I share again my screen. And now? You
Yes.
see it?
Now we can.
Okay. So I think the best evidence is this fossil that I just talked about. So these are large vesicles with processes, but also wall made of plates. And to do that, I think you need a cytoskeleton. There are also other fossils that I didn't have time to show, but I don't know, I don't have them here. They are about the same age, 1.65. There are some a little bit older. Either wall is made of plates, also wall that are decorated with spines, but no plates. And to have this kind of morphology, but also very plastic morphology. So I'm talking about other fossils that's not on this slide. I think you require a cytoskeleton. I know that recently the archaea that were found, they had also long processes, like long spines. And they have a cytoskeleton also, actually, the prokaryotes and these archaea. And actually, the cytoskeleton of these archaea might be homologous to the eukaryotic one. But they are very tiny, like they are 500 nanometer in diameter. We don't know if they are preservable, if they are made of recalcitrant carbon, a carbonaceous material, and they never reach the size of this fossil and the complexity of this fossil that you see on the screen. To my knowledge, no prokaryotes made a wall made of organic plates. This kind of complexity is not known. So I would say the minimum age for the eukaryotic cytoskeleton will be 1.65 or perhaps even 1.7, but this is a new story for another time. So these again are minimum ages.
Anybody having another question?
I do.
Yes, please.
Okay, should I leave only the microphone on? Okay. Or also the camera?
That's
What?
It's up to you. I don't see
Oh,
you,
okay,
but
okay. No, it's just that I'm working for the first time with this with GoToMeet. Okay. One question: by comparing the possibilities of Perseverance and ExoMars, for sure, if we will ever be able to get back to Earth, Mars, regoliths, I believe you will be able to, you know, reveal so many things. But on the search of biosignature, do you think that how high is the chance of, you know, misinterpret these signatures and, you know, hoping for actually a sign of past life instead of, you know, an abiotic process that may produce such signatures?
Well, as you have seen in my talk, the challenges are very high already on Earth, where we can go and take the rock and bring it to the lab. So on Mars, it's even more challenging because you cannot go. Yes, you can go, but you have to wait to get sample. One day we will get back samples from Mars to the lab. That's why it's important to bring back samples, actually. But in the meantime, the rovers, they will do the job that we do on Earth. They will look at the rock surface, the sedimentary structure, the rock composition, and then select good target, drill, bring the rock into the rover, and then make different kinds of analysis with actually the same instrument that we use in the lab. So infrared and Raman spectrometer, mass spectrometer. So that's interesting. So we can try to, and that's what we do actually, is try to mimic what kind of reproduce actually the analysis that will be done on Mars in the lab here, but with the ExoMars condition or the Perseverance condition. That said, if we find a good target, that means maybe again like my rock here. When you see this kind of rock, I don't know if you see it on Earth, you don't know in advance if there is life or not preserved in this rock. You know that the geological context is interesting, so it's possible that life was there and preserved there. You look for different kinds of clues using the instrument like ExoMars will do, but you don't know in advance. So, and again, if we find molecules, fossil molecules in the Noachian, they could be organics from meteorites. They could be organics forming abiotically on Mars, like they do on Earth, or they could be molecules formed by life. So I guess we will try to look for a combination of evidence again, habitable condition, preservation conditions that are possible to preserve organics, but organics associated, ideally associated with morphologies like microbial mat structures. That would be wonderful. But we have seen again that on Earth, if you only look at this structure or wrinklings in the rock, you cannot be you are not sure that they are mats actually. You need to do chemical analysis on them and combine all the type of analysis we can do. We cannot extract the organic on Mars, so well, kind of with the mass spectrometer, but it's not easy. So it will be difficult, but that's not why we should not try.
Okay, thank you.
And then
Beautiful.
also, don't forget that the Noachian is interesting in itself because it's much better preserved than the Archean or Hadean on Earth, because there is no plate tectonics, so there's no metamorphism, just a little bit by burying things or when there is a volcanic activity or hydrothermal activity. But if there are organics buried in the mud on Mars, they should be perhaps less cooked and less degraded. And also, even if we don't find life, we will know something about the early history of the solar system, the internal solar system and Earth, because many people think that both planets started in the same conditions. So when life appeared on Earth, the same conditions were perhaps on Mars. That's something that will be also examined with the ExoMars mission and the Perseverance mission. But then something went wrong, and we kind of know what went wrong, but not exactly. So we will have access to a time that has been erased on Earth or been very transformed on Earth. So that's just for that, it's really interesting to go study the Noachian. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Okay.
No.
Are there other questions? Seems not to be the case. In this case, I would like to thank you all for coming, and especially I would like to thank Emmanuel for this very broad and interesting talk. And I would also invite you again in 2 weeks at the same time at 4 o'clock by the next talk of our seminar, which will be given by Professor Nigel Mason from University of Kent in Canterbury, who is also the chair of Europlanet. If you want to take part in Emmanuel's working group, please just also contact her, and upon her discretion, you will be able to participate in the working group. It is also not necessary that your institution is part of the European Astrobiology Institute to participate. So I hope to see you all again in 2 weeks and wish you a very nice evening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you to all, and please join the working group if you want, if you're interested. Bye.